Welcome to the Preserving Family Podcast. The purpose of this podcast is to equip you to gain insight, information, and inspiration to help you protect, teach, and guide your family during these turbulent times. Our goal is to provide tools and resources to help you strengthen and preserve your own marriages and families. Now here are your hosts, Dr. Mark and Janie Ogletree.
Hello, everyone. So grateful to be with you today, and feeling so great to do a double podcast. Some of you may know that we have two podcasts that we run. One is called Preserving Families, and the other is called Stand By My Servants. And we're going to combine the two today because we are going to talk about President Dallin H. Oaks. We want to gear this in a way that it could be used as a tool for parents to teach their children, for grandparents to teach their grandchildren about this wonderful prophet and President Oaks. And I think the first thing I'd like to say is, obviously, I'm not an expert on Dallin H. Oaks. I do not profess to be. I love him. I have studied his life for quite a while. I teach a Living Prophets class at BYU, and so for the past 15 years, every semester we've spent 2 days on President Dallin H. Oaks. I've read as much as I possibly could, and have had even a couple of personal experiences with this wonderful, wonderful man, this prophet, seer, and revelator. Probably the first thing I'd like to share, and I share this because I share it with my students every semester, and I think it's important to find a way to convey this. But the way that people speak in church, in a church meeting, doesn't necessarily mean that that's who they are. And because President Oaks has this incredible, wonderful speaking style, and because in the past he hasn't been afraid to tackle some of the hard topics, and thank goodness that some of our leaders are willing to do that. But I think there's a huge misconception on who President Oaks is. I think people would think that he's very serious, that he's very strict, and to the point. Maybe he is some of those things, but I find President Oaks to be just a wonderful, wonderful human. I'll give you one example, and maybe you can appreciate this. Years ago, I was speaking at Education Week, and the topic was all 15. We talked about the first presidency and the quorum of the 12 apostles over a period of about a week. And I remember that after the presentation on Elder Dallin H. Oaks at the time, a man came up to me after the presentation and said, "Hey, could I share something with you?" I said, "Of course." And he said, "Well, I was a stake president years ago in Orlando, Florida. It was our stake conference, and my job was to pick up President Oaks from the airport." He said, "And of course, I'm dressed in my suit, and I'm dressed up for our stake conference. And to my dismay, when Elder Oaks got off the airplane, he was wearing a Hawaiian shirt, khaki pants, and sandals." And he said, "I just was not expecting that at all." And I'm sure President Oaks could tell that this stake president was a little bit surprised. And so President Oaks just said, "Hey, excuse me, hope you don't mind the way that I'm dressed, but I like to be comfortable when I fly." On another occasion, I had the chance to ask a person, I'll just keep them anonymous for right now, who was an administrator at Brigham Young University for years. And I was asking him to tell me about some of his favorite BYU presidents to work with, some of his favorites. And one of those favorites was Dallin H. Oaks. And at the time, this conversation took place in maybe the early 1990s. And so the Elder Oaks, of course, that I knew, like so many, was just the man who spoke in conference and that perfect, awesome voice, but who tackled those hard topics, and that's all I knew. And this man said, "No, Dallin H. Oaks was one of my favorites." He said he would come into my office. Sometimes he'd put his feet up on my desk. He'd put his hands behind his head and lean back in the chair and just say, "Hey, how are you doing? What's going on?" And sometimes they would talk for an hour and just catch up. He was that kind of warm and personal leader. My first experience with President Oaks was in our stake a few years ago. President Oaks' family, they lived in one of the wards in our stake, and one of his granddaughters was speaking at a missionary homecoming. And so I found myself, because of my calling, sitting on the stand next to President Oaks, which was wonderful. Throughout the meeting, President Oaks would lean over to me. He He would say something very kind or nice. Often he would put his hand on my knee, and it was just a great symbol of affection. Sometimes his arm around me as he would ask me questions about our steak. And once again, I just found him warm and tender. He did get up and speak for a couple of minutes, shared his testimony at the very end, and then when the meeting was over, he told those in charge that he would like to go to every classroom of the youth and meet every youth personally in that ward. So when I think of President Oaks, this is the man who I think of. My wife and I, Janie, were just at an event not long ago with the Stella Oaks Foundation, and it was a small gathering in a private home. President Oaks made sure he spoke to every single person. And once again, was so warm and so kind and so loving. And that's the Dallin H. Oaks that I know. Well, let me share this with you. And I do find Richard Turley's biography of President Oaks very helpful. But it feels like almost every prophet, every president of the church has almost had a near-death experience of some kind. And here's one from President Oaks' life. He was 9 months old. And in that day, before children were routinely strapped into vehicles using safety seats or even seat belts, Dallin Oaks was riding in the family car. His mother, Stella, was driving and started through the intersection of 1st North and 2nd West Streets in Provo. Her vision was partially blinded by the brilliant sunlight glaring off the pavement. That glare kept her from seeing another vehicle enter the intersection. With little time for their drivers to react and brake, the two cars collided violently. So much so that Jessie, a passenger in Stella's car, sustained numerous injuries, including cuts on her forehead, wrist, and shoulder. But even worse, the crash catapulted little Dallin from his parents' car like a missile, tossing him headlong or head first onto the concrete street. Miraculously, reported a newspaper writer, the toddler sustained bruises on his head but did not suffer a serious injury at the time. Once again, which is just miraculous. Now I'm going to quote from President Oaks' book called Life Lessons Learned. And if you haven't read that, I recommend it highly. It was 1940, and it looked like smooth sailing ahead. Lloyd Oaks, Dallin's father, had a thriving medical practice in Twin Falls, Idaho. After he had done postdoctoral work in Vienna, Austria, and Cairo, Egypt, the family had settled down for a life of security and prosperity. But in the fall of 1939, so we'll go back 1 year, Lloyd was diagnosed with tuberculosis and hospitalized in Denver, Colorado. And although he received optimal care, the doctors could not stop the disease from advancing. And Lloyd Oaks died on June the 10th, 1940. Lloyd was 37 years old, and Dallin Oaks, the oldest child in the family, would be baptized in August, 2 months later. So Dallin is still 7 years of age. Now, the first month in the hospital, Stella wrote to her husband, because I'm sure Stella was home with the children, and back in Twin Falls, Idaho, "You shall be healed if your faith is great enough. Recovery is according to our faith. The blessing is ours for the faith in asking." A week later, she wrote, "If your faith is great enough, there is no blessing that God can withhold from us." Many prominent priesthood leaders, including the president of the Western States Mission in Denver and a visiting member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, all visited Lloyd in the hospital, and they gave him priesthood blessings that contained promises of healing. Each of these leaders rebuked the disease and commanded that my father be made whole. 2 years earlier, as Lloyd and Stella were leaving for additional medical studies in Europe, a member of the Quorum of the 12 blessed Lloyd with these words: "The time will come when you will heal thousands." And President Oaks said that promise also had sustained my parents during my father's illness, and then added to my mother's dismay when he died. So here you have it, everyone. A mission president, a member of the Quorum of the 12, they bless Lloyd that he's going to recover, he's going to live. And so when he dies, that is hard to comprehend. 10 days before my father died, Elder Oaks wrote, the doctors advised my mother, who was now in Denver, that they had done everything that they could do, that the disease would soon take her husband's life. Numb with shock, she wrote their bishop in Twin Falls, Idaho, that a great peace had come to her, and that I am ready to say, thy will be done. Her acceptance and her healing had begun, but her questions remained. Well, the answer was given at the funeral by President J.W. Richens of the Twin Falls Stake. This inspired leader declared this. He said, all was done medically and in faith and in prayer that could be done for him, for Lloyd. No doubt the most earnest and sincere prayer that ever was offered was the one offered while the Master was in the Garden of Gethsemane and prayed most earnestly to his Father, may this cup pass by me. But it closed with these remarks, not my will, but thine be done. And so it was with the Savior himself. His prayer was not answered because it was not the will of the Lord. And so our prayers have not been answered as we have asked for Lloyd's recovery, but have always said, thy will be done. Now, Elder Oaks, you could tell that this was something that bothered him and that he wrestled with for a long time. Probably for most of his life, from the time his father died until he was maybe even an apostle. Because, once again, how does a mission president and a member of the Quorum of the 12 pronounce a blessing of healing, and then your dad dies? So here's what Elder Oaks says. Years later, in 2 talks given at General Conference, I summarized the lessons I had learned from this experience. In the first, I said this: faith, no matter how strong it is, cannot produce a result contrary to the will of him whose power it is. The exercise of faith in the Lord Jesus Christ is always subject to the order of heaven, to the goodness and to the will and wisdom and timing of the Lord. So no matter what kind of blessing we give, and no matter what kind of faith we have, if that faith is contrary to the Lord's will, it's not going to work. And then second, even the servants of the Lord exercising his divine power in a circumstance where there is sufficient faith to be healed, they cannot give a priesthood blessing that will cause a person to be healed if that healing is not of the Lord. So this is an incredible life lesson for us that helps us and reminds us the Lord's will is going to be done, right? And our job as priesthood leaders is to be in tune to that will so we can give blessings according to the Lord's will. Well, let's go back now. It's 1940-ish, and President Oaks' father has just died. He was about to be baptized. His mother was left with 3 small children to raise, which was a difficult adjustment for her to make. She tried to go to work after the death of her husband, but it was just too much and too soon. She suffered a nervous breakdown. That's a word we don't use that much anymore. Growing up as a kid, I always remember my mom telling us she was going to have a nervous breakdown. And the only thing I can equate that to today is just mega stress, panic attack, anxiety. 8-year-old Dallin was sent to live with his mother's parents on their farm near Payson, Utah, about 12 miles south of Provo. Now that was not easy. And despite the tender care of loving grandparents, Elder Oaks said, my 3rd and 4th grade years in school, when I was between 8 and 10 years old, were just terribly unhappy to me, he said. I rode a school bus from the farm 2 miles south of Payson, Utah. The few grade schoolers on this high school bus were buffeted and bullied. I remember having no identity with these fellow travelers and being tossed about on the bus like a rag doll. And since the bus stopped at the high school, I had to walk, usually alone, about a mile further to the Petit Neat grade school. If I was late getting back to the bus after school, it was gone, and I had to walk 2 more miles to get home. My most vivid memory of that year was passing in our arithmetic papers forward to be graded publicly, and of how the announced results usually put me at the bottom of the class. In a 20-problem exercise, I usually had 15 or 16 wrong answers. I knew that I was the dumbest boy in the room, and I remember on one occasion when some classmates threw snowballs at me and called me stupid. And so here's what I'm visualizing, but here's President Oaks, who he's lost his father. He's living with his grandparents. His mom is probably away now. She went to Columbia University to get a graduate degree so that she can come back and raise her family as a single mother. And his world has just been rocked. I mean, talk about post-traumatic stress. And he is really struggling. Well, the good news is that's all going to change. In August of 1942, Stella feels much better and the family moves to Vernal, Utah, where Stella teaches at Uinta High School. And there, Elder Oaks, the family stabilizes. And they would later move to Provo so the children could be close to BYU. Stella Oaks, by the way, just becomes a force to be reckoned with in such a powerful way. She becomes the director of adult education for Provo City Schools. She became a very respected and influential woman in the community where she was elected to the Provo City Council. I think she was even the mayor, like a temporary mayor for a while in Provo. But it was also in Vernal where Elder Oaks found himself, and the dumbest boy in class became one of the brightest. He attributes his success to a combination of a loving teacher, Pearl Schaefer, and getting back together with his family. And it was Mrs. Schaefer who put her arm around young Dallin and said, "You can do it. You got this. I'm with you." And that just changed everything. One of the things that young Dallin remembers is the faith of his mom. He remembers that she would review her prayers, their prayers, their commitments and covenants, almost reminding the Lord that we had paid our tithes and offerings, that the desired blessing was, as nearly as we could judge, a righteous desire, that we were serving in our various callings to the best of our ability, and that now we were laying hold on the Lord's promises. He said, "I can't communicate the sincerity and the fervor of those pleas, or the sincerity of the way she lived." She said once that she always paid her tithes and offerings because then the Lord would make things happen that she could not. And he did, President Oaks says. And then he says this, and this is from an article in the Ensign, April of 1981. "Because my mother had no doubts about the Lord's reality and in his ability to answer her prayers," President Oaks says, "I haven't either." And then he paused. "This is a very personal thing to talk about, and I don't do it very often because it's hard to do without sounding overconfident. But I would be scared to death to try and undertake something without asking for the Lord's help. So I always pray for the help, and I've never failed to get it. Personal revelation is part of my faith and part of my approach to life. All my adult life I've had responsibilities for which I've needed a lot of extra help. But when I've had the assurance of the Lord's help, I've never been afraid to go ahead." And then he gives an example. "Coming to BYU was a big challenge, but I wasn't afraid. I knew I could do it because I had received that assurance from the Lord," he said. Well, another thing I love about President Oaks is his work ethic. You want to make future apostles? They've got to be hard workers, right? We just aren't going to raise a generation of apostles and prophets on a diet of cotton candy and soda and video games, right? These are all men and women who have been such hard workers. I'm speaking of their wives. When Elder Oaks was 11 years old, he began his first job, and he has said that he has been working ever since, and now he's in his 90s. That first job was sweeping out a radio repair shop. He had to learn to test the radio tubes he found on the floor to find out which were good, and that led to an interest in radio. He threw himself into study with characteristic intensity. Before he was 16, he had obtained a first-class radio telephone license, which allowed him to operate a commercial radio station's transmitter, and found a job in radio. Station managers like to hire a combination man, an engineer who could double as an announcer. He said, but my voice had not changed yet. Before long, however, that change took care of itself, and he was working regularly as an announcer. Now, at the age of 14, in the summer of 1946, President Oaks worked on his grandfather's farm in Payson. Now, here's a list of some of the work he accomplished: milking cows, hauling wheat and hay, hauling manure and trash, hoeing and cultivating the garden, building fences, tending the animals, doing roofing repair work on some of the sheds, irrigating, building calf pens and sheds, driving cattle to a nearby community on horseback, working on ditches, cutting thistles, hauling limbs in the orchard, and even sanding and painting the old Ford. Now that is quite an incredible work ethic. One of the most touching messages in our general conference that we just had here in October of 2025, the closing talk was given by President Dallin H. Oaks of the quorum of the 12 apostles. He talked about a lot of things regarding the family in that message. But I wanted to share this with you because it fits perfectly right here where we are in our message today. He said, "Our doctrine and our belief in eternal family strengthen and bond us. I will never forget the promise of my maternal grandfather Harris when we children were living on his farm near Payson, Utah. He gave me the tragic news that my father had died in faraway Denver, Colorado. I ran into the bedroom and knelt beside the bed, crying my heart out. Grandpa followed me and went to his knees beside me and said, 'I will be your father.' That tender promise is a powerful example of what grandparents can do to fill the gaps when families lose or are missing a member," he said. I thought that was so touching. You may remember how emotional President Oaks was as he told that story. I want to go back and develop something a little bit more that I just mentioned briefly. But so when Dallin Oaks was 15 years old, he studied on his own, he scraped a bus fare together, and he took a bus to Denver and got his first-class commercial radio operator's license at a federal examination session. And pretty soon he lands a job in radio. And this isn't exaggeration at all, but President Oaks was so instrumental in running that radio station as a teenager that he was often called outside of class, from classes at his high school here in Provo, to go solve problems at the radio station. And then he continued that, so he's working 20 to 30 hours a week at a radio station while he's in high school, and then that continues when he's in college. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Now, Elder Oaks always planned on serving a mission. He graduates from high school probably in June of 1950. Thousands of miles away, 1 week after that, high school graduation, a North Korean army crossed the 38th parallel, and now our country was at war. I was 17 years old. But as a member of the Utah National Guard, I was soon under orders to prepare for mobilization and active service. And so suddenly, for me and for many other young men of my generation, the full-time mission we had planned or assumed was not to be. That's from a talk Elder Oaks gave called Timing. Now, here's the thing. Dallin H. Oaks would not be one who would just sit on his hands or twiddle his thumbs and just wait to be called up. He was waiting for his unit to be activated, and they still weren't called up. And so when the fall came, this was in June, when the fall came in September, and they still hadn't been called up, he enrolled in BYU, thinking that any day now I could be called up and heading to Korea. Didn't happen. In the wintertime, still waiting to be called up, did not happen. He continues in school. In the springtime, waiting to be called up, it didn't happen, and so he just keeps going to school. He's going to major in accounting at BYU. And while all this is going on, he's also announcing high school basketball games on the radio, and this is where he meets his wife, June Dixon, a Spanish Fork drill team member that he's noticing, as he's announcing these basketball games. They're married in the Salt Lake Temple on June the 24th, 1952. Now, when they get married, they're pretty young. I mean, when you think that he graduated in June of 1950 from high school, and by June the 24th, 1952, they're married. So Dallin H. Oaks is 19 years of age when he gets married, and he's going to graduate from BYU at the age of 21. I love some of his candid comments about he and his wife, June. He said, number one, she brought out the best in me. June has kept me from getting pompous or self-important, he said. And then another great statement. He said, a disagreement with June just wipes me out. And since I know I can't work until I get it resolved, and since I'm usually wrong anyway, I just apologize as soon as I can. Our children can't claim that they've never heard us disagree. June and I have had some marvelous disagreements, but we've always worked them out. Isn't that refreshing to hear an apostle say, you know what, we've had disagreements. Yeah, we don't get along. We don't see eye to eye on everything, but we work it out. And then this great tribute. I don't know about you, but one of the things that impresses me more than anything else, I think it's one of the greatest Christ-like attributes, and that is people who just don't talk bad or say anything negative about anyone. And this is what June said about her husband, Dallin. He is like his mother, and that he never criticizes anyone. I've never heard him say anything unkind about anyone, and we've been married for almost 30 years. That is so impressive to me. After 30 years of marriage, I don't think I've ever heard him say a word about anyone negative. June is saying that. And once again, isn't it also ironic in a way that in our generation, the apostle who has been criticized the most, who has received the most buckshot, so to speak, on social media, is actually a person who doesn't say anything bad about anyone? I just think that's so incredible. Well, President Oaks continued his schooling and graduated from BYU in 1954 with high honors. At this point, the Oaks have 2 children. They're going to end up having 6. He admits that in his early college studies, they were a bit erratic. He says, I did not perform at a consistently high level until June came into my life. And he said, I owe so much to her. And then June said this, he's the most outstanding man that I know. At 18, he was outstanding. He's immensely gifted, and he's prepared himself. I don't think anything he accomplishes will ever surprise me. And now here he is. June doesn't get to see it from this mortal vantage point, but here he is, will be the next president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Elder Oaks has often quoted his motto, work first, play later, but his family jokes, nope, it's actually work first, play never. When Dallin was in law school, he would be gone every day from 7 in the morning until 11 at night, except on Sundays. June Oaks recalls hearing him say that there are a lot of guys over there at the law school who are smarter than I, but none will work harder. That expression has been one that we have carried into our family and said the same thing to our own children, is there may be people smarter than you, but guess what? No one can outwork you. No one will be able to outwork you. You just keep working. And President Oaks knew, he had that confidence that he was a hard worker. And that stood him well. By the way, he would come home at lunchtime and spend some time with his 2 daughters. And one of their favorite games was called Daddy Be a Bear. And this is where President Oaks acted like a bear. He's on the floor. He's crawling on hands and knees. He's growling like a bear and chasing those little girls all over the apartment. And of course, they're running and laughing at the same time and giggling. But he found a way to be a really good dad all at the same time. He began his legal career as a clerk to U.S. Justice Earl Warren of the Supreme Court. He practiced corporate law for 3 years in Chicago at the law firm of Kirkland & Ellis. And then in 1961, he became an associate professor of law at the University of Chicago, and later served as an associate dean and then acting dean of the law school. He helped write the Bill of Rights for Illinois, the Illinois Constitution Convention, the state's new constitution. In 1970, he was named the executive director of the American Bar Foundation. And while all that was going on, another fun story to tell is when President Oaks was at the height of his law career at the law firm. This is before he comes to the University of Chicago. And he was working until late every night. And some of you young attorneys know what that's like. He was called in by the stake president to be interviewed to be what we would call today a ward missionary, but in those days it was called a stake missionary. And the requirement was 10 hours of missionary work a week. And President Oaks just didn't know how he was going to be able to do that. How would he fit in 10 hours of missionary work? He's already working till 10 or 11 o'clock every night. But he prayed about it, exercised faith, and accepted that call, and found out that as he was serving in that capacity as a stake missionary, not only were they successful with bringing people into the church, but also his practice began to thrive even more. He was working less hours and making more money. He was prospering. And that became important because a few years later, he was called into the stake presidency at a very young age in the Chicago stake, and now had established himself as someone who had that kind of faith and who knew that if he put the Lord first, that everything would work out the way that it needed to. Now, another crazy experience is in 1971. President Oaks, Dallin H. Oaks, is made the president of BYU at the age of 38, which everyone, that is just unheard of. And once again, you may wonder about that and think, at the age of 38, how do you do that? But President Oaks was an incredible BYU president. maybe one of the top BYU presidents of all time. And once again, if you're thinking of Elder Oaks as the stiff, person who is giving these formal talks and not really connecting well with people, he was just the opposite. He literally had such a connection with the students at BYU. I'm looking right now at a picture of President Oaks with the Cosmo the Cougar uniform on, where he's dancing out there at halftime at a basketball game, and they're trying to guess who is it, and then President Oaks, the president, pulls off the Cosmo head, and here's Dallin Oaks, the BYU president, who was out there on the floor. But he had a lot of fun and a lot of great interaction with the students. And one of the things about President Oaks that I've always been impressed by is the way that he relies on the Spirit for answers. As a new and inexperienced president, he said in an article that was published in the Daily Universe in 1984, I had many problems to analyze and many decisions to reach. I was very dependent on the Lord, and one day in October I drove up Provo Canyon to ponder a particular problem, and although alone and without any interruption, I found myself unable to think of the problem at hand. Now I'm going to take a time out for a minute. My wife and I and some others from our stake were up at Aspen Grove a couple of years ago. President Oaks came to Aspen Grove because his son and their family were serving in the branch presidency of that branch for the summer. And President Oaks decided that he wanted to share a personal experience with everyone there. And his experience was about the one I'm sharing with you. But I've always imagined when he said that he drove up Provo Canyon to ponder a problem, I just visualized him pulling off a dirt road or something and sitting in his car and praying over this problem. But that's not what happened. He was all the way up at Aspen Grove. There's a cabin at Aspen Grove called the Harris Cabin. And of course, part of President Oaks' lineage, he's a Harris. And yes, if you're thinking, you mean like Martin Harris? Oh yeah, like Martin Harris. Martin Harris has a brother named Emer Harris. And Dallin H. Oaks is like a great-great-grandson of Emer Harris. And there's the Harris Cabin up at Aspen Grove. And President Oaks, as the president of BYU, has driven all the way up to Aspen Grove to just get some peace and solitude and to ponder over a problem. Now back to the story. As he's pondering over what we'll call problem A, problem B continues to push itself to the forefront of his mind. He said, it just kept thrusting itself into my mind. And here's what the issue was. You may not be aware, but years ago, BYU was on a quarter system. And as part of that quarter system versus a semester system, can you imagine this? You would go home for the Christmas holidays, come back, and take your finals for the fall quarter. And President Oaks was just like, there's got to be a better way. And what does he do? Instead, he receives a revelation on how to adjust the BYU academic schedule so that 4 semesters could be put into a 1-year time frame. A fall semester for 16 weeks, a winter semester for 16 weeks, and then 2 terms in the spring and summer. One in the summer, each 8 weeks long. And by the way, everyone, I have been to several universities in my life, and no one had a system like BYU. There's a lot of colleges and universities that have a summer term of some kind, but I don't know anyone who fits in a spring term and a summer term like they do at BYU. Within a few minutes, he says, I had recorded the details of a semester calendar with all the powerful advantages. So I like that President Oaks is turning to the Lord, and he's receiving answers to guide and direct a university. Now, another thing I told you, that he was personal and that he's warm. And so in this particular story, from a talk he gave called The Student Body and the President on September 9th, 1975, he tells of the experience of going to what we'll call like the Cannon Center and just sitting next to a table of young freshman boys. He didn't introduce himself at first, but he began to question the group about their experience and their view of BYU. And then one of the young men finally pipes off and says, hey, wait a minute, do you work here or something? When I replied that I did, he asked a few more questions on his own, like, well, what do you do? I said, I'm the president, I replied. Ignoring his neighbor's jabbing elbow, he pressed on, well, you're the president of what? I explained that I'm the president of BYU. And he says, we all had a tight laugh together. And then he added this comment that I'll never forget. He said, well, I go to the devotionals and I see you there, but you're just so far away, I just don't see your face, which is a great way to save that. But once again, the point for me is that here's President Oaks eating lunch with the students at BYU. He was really involved with that student body. After Elder Oaks dressed up like Cosmo the Cougar at a BYU basketball game, a student editor wrote this in the BYU newspaper: President Dallin Oaks is a man of great dignity, but even with his dignity, he avoids the stuffed shirt image. He has not only earned our respect, but I believe he has proved himself to be one of us. I love that. And then President Oaks gave numerous inspiring speeches and devotional addresses. I love this. He didn't just talk, he walked the walk. He said this: you belong to a community of workers and doers, not a community of dreamers and aesthetics, piously and passively waiting for the millennium. And President Oaks was a doer. He practiced what he preached. And I'm quoting back from Turley's biography here on President Oaks. Being a good Samaritan and taking time to serve others, even as the busiest man on campus. When a visiting Pennsylvania couple were knocked unconscious in a traffic accident near his university home, President Oaks called an ambulance and went to the aid of the injured. When the ambulance driver showed up alone, the president drove the ambulance so the driver could attend to the wounded en route to the hospital. While Dallin H. Oaks served as the president of BYU, his words spoke loud and his actions even louder. No wonder the student body presented him with its exemplary manhood award given annually to a man who has achieved success through his own courage and application, and whose life is considered a pattern for the men of BYU to emulate. I love that. Here's another insight to President Oaks. So one of the things I really like about President Oaks, we've already heard him say, my wife and I, we don't agree on everything. Sometimes we have to work things out. Our children can never claim they have never heard us disagree, because they have. Here's another great story. This one comes from Life's Lessons Learned. He says, during my first 5 years as president at BYU, I was one of about 5 leaders who had a weekly coordination meeting with Neil A. Maxwell, who at the time was the church commissioner of education. One day he began our meeting by asking, what would you like to be remembered for after you are released from your present positions? He asked each of us to write our answer on a piece of paper and consider it privately. Pondering this inspired question taught me an important lesson. I applied it not only to my employment, but also to my position as a father. I asked myself, when your children are grown up and leave home, or when you die, what do you want them to remember about you as a father? This question caused me to see that I was in danger of being remembered for always being critical and nagging about trivial behaviors that irritated me, such as the practice of a teenage daughter who continually scattered her clothes and other possessions all around the house. I wanted to be remembered for fatherly communications of praise and love and other matters of eternal importance. And so this question of what do you want to be remembered for was something that really, really resonated with President Oaks. And he reflected on his life as a dad and realized that he needed to make some changes. And by the way, he doesn't mind telling us that in his book. President Oaks' children, and I always think this is such a great litmus test, but they loved and revered their father. They love and revere him today. If I think of one word that epitomizes my father, his daughter Sharman said, I think of the word integrity. I've always known that he would never do anything that wasn't above reproach. She remembered that once he'd chided her for trying to remove an uncanceled stamp from an envelope, which came in the mail so she could use the stamp again. Another comment here. The BYU years were less busy than the Chicago years had been. Lloyd recalls, oldest son Lloyd. He said, our father was home much more. But just about every Saturday we'd go and pick up some night crawlers in Springville and head up the canyon to fish in the Spanish Fork River. After a while, Lloyd would tire of fishing and collect or throw rocks, but his father would keep at it. And then June said this of her husband: if he fishes with the same intensity as when he goes after a case. And then it says this: Lloyd was not surprised by his father's call as a general authority. He said, all through my dad's life, he's been very close to the Spirit. One night, Lloyd had asked to use the family car to go to a party. He was getting ready to back out of the driveway when his father came out and asked him not to go, explaining that he felt impressed that it just would not be wise. They later learned that another car had rolled off the road Lloyd would have been driving on about at that exact same time, and they felt that impression was certainly a warning from the Spirit. Charmin also speaks of her father's closeness to the Spirit. She recalls coming in home late at night during the high school years, going into her parents' bedroom to say goodnight and finding her father on his knees in prayer. Both of her parents were examples in so many ways. One thing we appreciated was that our father and mother loved each other. I love this. She said, just walking into the kitchen and catching my father kissing my mother. It's one of my favorite memories. And I love that about President Oaks and his affection to his wife, June, in that case. Well, if you can imagine, if you start as the president of BYU at age 38, if you're going to be an Ernest Wilkinson and be there for years and years and years, you could be 50 or 60 by the time you're done. Elder Oaks was wearing himself out. He was getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, being at the office by 6 a.m., working all day, coming home in the evening, spending some time with his family, going back into his study at his home, working from 9 p.m. to midnight every night, and then waking up again in the morning, rinse and repeat. And after 8 or 9 years of that, he was just really burning out, and he was missing his family. He wanted to find a way to be more connected to his family, and so he was the one who recommended that he be released as the president of BYU in August of 1980. Now, he wasn't quite sure what he was going to do next, but there were many different opportunities that were presented to him. But one of the ones that intrigued him the most was a vacancy on the Utah Supreme Court. Now, he said the annual salary of a Utah Supreme Court justice was a fraction of what the other opportunities were paying. Now, let me just make a comment right here, because I've heard it said of President Eyring by one of his sons, and I've heard it said of President Oaks by one of his sons. But every job these two men took, they made less money. So in the case of Dallin H. Oaks, he starts off at a private law firm making some good, solid money. But he takes a pay cut to go to the University of Chicago and teach at the law school. And then he takes another pay cut when he comes to BYU to be the president. And then he takes another pay cut to be a Utah Supreme Court justice, right? On September the 26th, 1980, Elder Oaks wrote this in his journal. This morning, June and I went into the temple to seek inspiration on our decision. During the entire session, I couldn't get my mind off the Utah Supreme Court. Try as I might, and I did try continuously. And all of this consciousness of the prospect that I might do this, I did not have one negative thought or apprehension, nor have I had any in my deliberations up to this point. This is a persuasive confirmation in itself, he said. Or in other words, when you're seeking revelation and it just doesn't go away, that's a great confirmation, right? That's the right thing to do. Then as we sat on the sofa in the last room, which we all recognize as the celestial room, June and I prayed quietly by ourselves, and as I finished, this thought flooded my mind, being repeated over and over. Go to the court, and I will call you from there. The immediate significance of the words go to the court, and I will call you from there, confirmed my decision to apply for the court vacancy. But it was not until I was called to the Quorum of the 12 in April of 1984, while serving on the court, that I realized the significance of those last 7 words. And I will call you from there. In fact, it wasn't until I reread my journal as I was writing this book, the book is called Life's Lessons Learned, that I was reminded of that portion of the personal revelation, I had recorded it faithfully, but without understanding its long-term significance. Well, everyone, I think I'm going to stop right here because I can go on for hours. But we'll do another couple sections of this message. But this is Teaching Our Families about President Dallin H. Oaks, Part 1. And I think there's going to be a couple parts to this because I would love to share as much as I can about this wonderful, beloved prophet, Dallin H. Oaks, who the Lord has preserved at this time to be the prophet, seer, and revelator for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right here and right now. Everyone, I hope you have a wonderful week, and I hope you will share this podcast with anyone that could benefit by it. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.